The gun was already cocked when Fannie Thatcher walked through the door. She did not scream. She had been raised in Philadelphia, educated at the Barton Academy for Young Ladies, trained in decorum, deportment, and the precise management of other people's chaos. So when she stepped across the threshold of the Chandler Ranch house and found herself staring down the barrel of a rusty Colt revolver held in the hands of a 9-year-old boy standing on top of the dining room table, she did not scream. She set down her traveling bag. She straightened her spine. She looked the child directly in the eye. "Put that down before you shoot yourself," she said. The boy did not put it down. He was wild-eyed and barefoot, with mud caking his trousers to the knee, and he had the particular look of a child who had never once in his living memory been told no by anyone who followed through. "You the new governess?" he demanded. "I am," Fannie said. "And you are pointing a firearm at me, which is not how one greets a guest." "You ain't a guest," the boy said. "You're the help." From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of breaking crockery and then a peal of laughter so sharp and bright it cut through the walls like a knife. Upstairs, something heavy dragged itself across the ceiling in a long scraping arc. A door slammed. Then another. Then a third. Fannie did not move. She held the boy's gaze with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "What is your name?" she asked. "Sam," he said. "Samuel," she corrected gently. "And how old are you?" "9. "Then you are old enough to know that a revolver is not a toy, and you are old enough to understand what happens to boys who point weapons at people who have done them no harm." She took one careful step toward him. "Now put it down." Sam stared at her for 3 full seconds that stretched like hours. Then his arm dropped, the barrel swinging harmlessly toward the floor, and something that might have been respect flickered across his muddy face. He shoved the gun into the waistband of his trousers with an attitude that suggested this was perfectly normal. It was the moment the back door banged open that everything changed. He came in the way storms came into rooms, fast and enormous, and filling every inch of available air. Levi Chandler stood 6'2" in his worn leather boots, broad through the shoulders, lean at the hip, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a jaw carrying 3 days of stubble that the razor had not recently troubled. He was carrying a saddle over one arm and a broken bridle in the other hand, and he was talking before he had even fully cleared the doorframe. "Sam, I swear on your mother's grave, if you touch my Colt again, I will tan your hide so thoroughly you will not sit comfortably until—" He stopped. He saw Fannie. The saddle hit the floor. For one suspended moment, Levi Chandler looked at Fannie Thatcher the way a man looks at something he has not been expecting and cannot entirely categorize: surprise, assessment, and something else, something guarded and careful and immediately buried. She looked back at him the way a woman looks at a man who has just dropped an expensive saddle in his own kitchen and whose child has been holding her at gunpoint for the past 3 minutes. "Mr. Chandler," she said. "Miss—" He stopped, ran a hand through his hair. "Miss Thatcher." "The same," she said. "Your son was welcoming me with your revolver." The look Levi directed at Sam could have peeled paint. "I did not load it," Sam said defensively. "That is not the point," his father said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which was apparently worse than shouting because Sam climbed down from the table with remarkable speed and disappeared through the back hallway. Fannie and Levi Chandler stood in the wrecked kitchen of the Rocking Sea Ranch on the western edge of Laramie Territory in the spring of 1878, and for a single honest moment, they both looked at the sheer improbability of the situation that had brought them to this precise collision. She had answered the advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer 6 weeks ago. Governess needed, Laramie Territory, Wyoming. 3 children, ranch household, honest wages, room and board. The letter she had received back had been brief to the point of terseness, and had told her almost nothing except the date she was expected to arrive. She had imagined, of course she had imagined, something like the household she had served before, structured, orderly, families of means who had built respectability on the frontier. She had packed her McGuffey readers and her arithmetic primers and her best gray wool dress, and she had stepped onto the westbound train with the absolute conviction of a woman who knew exactly what she was walking into. She had known nothing at all. 3 weeks earlier, on the platform of the Laramie train depot, she had first understood that the West was not going to cooperate with her expectations. The town of Laramie in 1878 was not the frontier outpost of Eastern imagination. It had a courthouse, a newspaper, even a Masonic lodge. But the land beyond it was enormous in a way that made her feel very small and very far from everything she had ever understood as home. The man who had met her at the depot was one of Levi Chandler's ranch hands, a weathered fellow named Gus who spoke in monosyllables and drove the wagon with the particular focused silence of someone who had given up on conversation as a general principle. The road to the rocking sea was 40 miles of open sky and wind-bent grass and occasional stands of cottonwood that stood along the creek beds like sentinels. She had watched it all through the wagon's side curtain and felt something crack open inside her that she could not immediately name. It was not fear. She was certain of that much. It was something bigger, something that had no vocabulary in the Barton Academy curriculum. She had arrived at the ranch house at dusk, stiff from the wagon and still gathering herself, and the first thing she had seen was a child. A girl of about 12 walking along the top rail of the corral fence with her arms out for balance like a circus performer, her braid whipping in the evening wind, completely unaware or unconcerned that a fall in either direction would hurt considerably. The second thing she had seen was another child younger, a boy of perhaps 6, sitting in the middle of the yard feeding strips of dried beef to a half-grown coyote that was absolutely not a dog. The third thing she had seen was a chicken on the porch roof. And then she had walked inside and met Sam and the Colt revolver, and now she was standing in the wrecked kitchen facing Levi Chandler, who was looking at her with that careful, guarded expression that she was already beginning to understand was how he looked at most things that surprised him. "I apologize for Sam," he said. "There is no permanent harm done," she said. "He tells me it was not loaded." "I keep the ammunition in a separate place," Levi said. "He knows where it is. I had not actually expected him to find the gun again." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "I moved it twice." "Then he is resourceful," Fannie said. "That is something we can work with." Levi looked at her for a long moment. "You're not going to turn around and get back in the wagon." "Certainly not," she said. "I came a long way, Mr. Chandler. I do not turn around." She glanced around the kitchen, the broken crock on the floor, the muddy boot prints across the table, the curtains that had been pulled half off their rod by some force she did not yet want to investigate. "However, I would appreciate a tour of the household, an introduction to all 3 children in a controlled setting, and an understanding of what I am working with before I develop any sort of plan." Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile, not yet, but it was the precursor to one, a relaxing of the jaw, a faint warmth at the corners of his eyes. He was younger than she had expected, too. The advertisement had given her no information about age, and she had assumed why. Because he had 3 children, that he was a man of middle years. He was not. She estimated mid-30s, perhaps 34 or 35, and there was nothing middle-aged about him except the weight that sat in his eyes, the particular gravity that men accumulated not through years but through loss. She had learned to read that kind of weight. She had enough of her own. "All right," Levi said. He retrieved the saddle from the floor with an automatic economy of movement and hung it on the hook by the back door. "The controlled setting may be ambitious, but I'll introduce you." The girl on the fence was Cecily, 12 years old, and she descended from the corral rail with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once fallen from anything. She had her father's dark hair and green eyes so pale they were almost colorless, and she looked at Fannie with the specific assessment of a child who had already outlasted multiple adults and intended to outlast this one as well. "Can you ride?" Cecily asked. This was apparently the relevant criterion. "I have not had much occasion," Fannie said. Cecily's expression indicated that this was a significant deficiency. Papa had a governess before you. She cried when she saw a rattlesnake and left the next morning. I have never seen a rattlesnake, Fannie said. I cannot make any promises about my reaction, but I can tell you that I am not in the habit of crying. Cecily considered this. All right, she said, which Fannie understood to be a provisional acceptance. The small boy with the coyote was Danny, 6 years old, and he was so different from Sam and Cecily that it took Fannie a moment to reconcile them as siblings. Where the older two were dark and angular and sharp-edged, Danny was fair and round-cheeked and moved through the world with a gentle, dreaming quality that made him seem like something from a different story entirely. He looked up at Fannie with enormous blue eyes and said, quite seriously, "Her name is Rosa. She will not hurt you if you are calm." "I am very calm," Fannie said, with complete sincerity, and held out her hand, and the young coyote came to sniff it with the cautious courtesy of a creature that had made its own decision about trust. Danny smiled at her, and it was such a purely joyful smile that something turned over in Fannie's chest. Sam she had already met. He reappeared at supper wearing marginally less mud and sat at the table with the aggressive posture of a boy who had not yet decided how he felt about her. He was not hostile, exactly. He was testing. She recognized the behavior from the more complicated households she had served, children who had been hurt by departure and were not yet willing to risk connection. She understood it. She was not unsympathetic. What she was determined. Levi sat at the head of the table and served beans and salt pork and cornbread with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been feeding children without assistance for some time. The food was plain, but there was enough of it, and the kitchen, despite its current state of disorder, was well stocked. She noticed the ranch house as a whole in a series of accumulating impressions during that first meal. It was a serious house, built to last, the woodwork well-jointed and solid. But it had the particular atmosphere of a house that had lost its organizing principle. Everything was slightly wrong, not dirty, exactly, but displaced, as though objects had been put down in passing and never retrieved, as though no one had been tending the space with any intention. She had seen this before, too. After the children had been sent to their beds, a process that required 3 separate interventions from Levi and 1 direct command from Fannie that stopped Sam mid-staircase flight with the sheer authority of her tone, Levi poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and sat back down at the table. He did not sit across from her. He sat at an angle, as though he wanted the option of not looking directly at her. "I should tell you about the others," he said. "The previous governesses," she said. "There were 4. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "The first one, Mrs. Henley, lasted 6 weeks. She was a good woman. Cecily broke her spectacles and Sam let a garter snake into her room, and she wrote me a letter that said she had accepted a position in Denver and wished me well." He paused. "The second one was Mrs. Dalton. She was here 11 days. Sam and the rattlesnake, which Cecily had found and decided to keep temporarily." "I see," Fannie said. "The third one left after Danny's coyote pup got into her bedroom and ate her Sunday hat." He had the grace to look slightly apologetic about this. "The fourth one was the one Cecily mentioned. Rattlesnake in the yard, not in the house. She cried and left in the morning." Fannie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Have the children been deliberately running them off?" Levi set his cup down. He looked at her directly for the first time since supper, and she saw something in his expression that was not comfortable to look at honest pain, the kind that a man who does not discuss his pain wears in very specific ways. "Yes," he said. "Mostly Sam. Cecily plays along because she's loyal to Sam and because she genuinely doesn't see the need for a governess. Danny is too young to have any strategic intent, but he does not make things easier." He was quiet. "Their mother died 2 years ago, fever. It was," he stopped. The word came back changed. It was fast. There was no time to prepare for it. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed against the windows, immense and dark and full of wind. "I am sorry," Fannie said. And she meant it in the particular way she had learned to mean it, not as a social courtesy, but as a genuine acknowledgement of a wound she recognized. "They are good children," Levi said. "I need you to understand that." Under all the he gestured at the general context of his household. "They are good." "I can already see that," she said, and she could. She had seen it in Danny's careful introduction of his coyote, in Cecily's frank assessment, in Sam's quick drop of the gun when she had met him with steadiness instead of fear. The wildness was real, but it was not malice. It was grief wearing a costume. "Why did you come?" Levi asked. It sounded like a question that had been sitting in him since the moment he had seen her on his kitchen floor. "Out here. From Philadelphia. You could find positions closer to home." Fannie held her coffee cup with both hands the way he held his, and she looked at the surface of the liquid rather than at him, and she decided to tell him a version of the truth. "I needed to go somewhere that required my full attention," she said. "Somewhere that would not leave me time to be in my own head." He accepted this without probing, which she appreciated. He had the quality, she noticed, of a man who did not use conversation as leverage, who asked things because he genuinely wanted to know, and who received answers without bending them into weapons. She had not encountered that quality as often as she would have liked. She was given the room at the end of the upstairs hall, which had a window facing east and a view of the grassland going on forever in the direction of the rising sun. The bed was solid, and the mattress was not bad. Someone Levi, she suspected, from some instinct she could not immediately justify, had put a small vase of wildflowers on the windowsill. She did not remark on it, but she noticed it. She lay awake for a long time that first night, listening to the sound of the Wyoming dark. It was not like any night she had heard before. There were no city sounds at all, no wheels on cobblestone, no voices through walls. There was wind and the far-off sound of the creek, and once the thin yipping cry of a coyote on a ridge somewhere that was answered by Rosa from her place in the barn, and the sound was so lonesome and so alive at the same time that it made her throat ache. She did not cry. She had told Cecily she was not in the habit of it, and that was not entirely true. She was in the habit of it, actually, but she saved it for very particular moments when it could not be helped, and a wildflower on a windowsill and a coyote calling into the dark did not clear that bar. Not quite. She fell asleep with the wind in the grass and woke to a sunrise that turned the eastern plains from gray to copper to gold in stages so slow and so magnificent that she stood at the window in her nightgown for 10 minutes unable to move. Then she put on her dress and went down to make breakfast before anyone else was awake, and that was how she began the project of the Chandler household. The first 2 weeks were not easy. She would not have wanted easy. Easy would not have required her full attention, and full attention was precisely what she needed to keep herself from falling back into the dark hours that had sent her to the Enquirer's advertisement columns in the first place. Sam tested her constantly. He was clever about it, with the particular cleverness of a child who has calculated his adversaries and knows exactly where their tolerances end. He was too loud during lessons. He found reasons to be elsewhere. He made pronouncements about the pointlessness of mathematics and the superfluity of reading given that he was going to ranch cattle for the rest of his life, a statement he delivered with such conviction that Fannie was briefly impressed by it. "Every rancher who cannot do his own accounting is at the mercy of the man who can," she told him. "And every man who cannot read his own contracts will eventually sign something he should not have." Sam chewed on this for 3 days and then started showing up to morning lessons on time. Cecily was a different challenge entirely. She was not obstructive. She was perfectly willing to sit at the table and complete assignments with neat, accurate work. But she had the capacity for a politeness so precise and so impenetrable that it constituted its own form of resistance. She treated Fannie like a visiting dignitary, correct in every particular, never warm, never open. The real Cecily existed on horseback and along fence rails, and in conversations with her brothers that stopped the moment Fannie came within earshot. The thing that broke the distance between them was unexpected and accidental, as the best things generally are. It happened on the third Friday of Fanny's tenure, when a late spring storm rolled down from the mountains and pinned everyone inside for 2 days. Fanny found Cecily in the parlor, which was nearly always unused, sitting on the floor in front of the cold fireplace with a book open on her lap. The book was a novel, not one of the approved educational texts, but a dime novel about a frontier scout, which Fanny had seen Cecily smuggle from somewhere, and which she had decided to ignore on the principle that a child reading anything is a child reading. Cecily saw her, and immediately adopted the expression of someone expecting to be told to put it away. Fanny sat down on the floor beside her, which was not something that Cecily had anticipated. She looked at the page and then back at Fanny. "I know I should be reading something improving," Cecily said. "What you should be doing on a rainy afternoon is reading something that keeps you in the room rather than climbing out the window," Fanny said. "Which is what Sam is currently plotting. I would rather have you here." Cecily looked startled, then cautiously a smile. "He thinks you don't notice things." "Everyone thinks I don't notice things," Fanny said. "It is one of my most useful qualities." The smile widened into something genuine, and Cecily shifted the book so they could both see it, and they sat on the floor of the Chandler parlor together while the storm raged outside and the fire Fanny built took hold and warmed the room. She did not try to make Cecily talk. She did not require any performance from her. She simply sat and was present, and after a while Cecily began to talk on her own, haltingly at first, then with increasing ease, about her mother and about the ranch, and about how she had taught herself to ride because no one had had time to properly teach her, and about how she had decided, in the absolute private conviction of her heart, that she was going to breed quarter horses when she grew up. "That is a serious and worthwhile ambition," Fanny said. Cecily stared at her as though she had said something in a foreign language. "My last governess said it was unladylike," Cecily said, "not accusatory, just reporting." "Your last governess left over a rattlesnake," Fanny said. "I would not take her assessments of ladylike behavior as the final word." Cecily laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it transformed her face so completely that Fanny understood in that instant what Levi had meant when he said they were good children. Underneath all the testing and the armor, Cecily was extraordinary. All three of them were. Levi noticed the change. He was observant in the way of a man who had learned to watch things carefully and say little, who had grown up where survival required reading weather and terrain, and people with equal accuracy. He tracked the household's emotional weather the way he tracked the actual weather, and he noticed when things shifted. He noticed when Sam started appearing for breakfast before he was called. He noticed when Danny began bringing Rosa to the back porch during lesson time and staying within range of the parlor window, listening. He noticed when Cecily stopped that particular brand of remote courtesy and began speaking to Fanny in her real voice. He did not say anything about it for nearly 3 weeks. He let it accumulate. The first time they talked alone, really talked, not the logistics of household management and daily schedules, was on a Sunday evening when the children were in bed, and the ranch was quiet, and Fanny had come out onto the porch for air. She had been there for 10 minutes, watching the stars, which were something she still had not adjusted to. In Philadelphia, the night sky was a thing you glanced at between rooftops. Here it was the entire ceiling of the world, so dense with stars that the darkness between them seemed secondary, and it still stopped her in her tracks every time. Levi came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without asking if she wanted it, which she found she did not mind. He stood beside her and they both looked at the sky for a while without speaking, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. That surprised her. She had a careful inner catalog of the kinds of silences she had known in various households, the silence of disapproval, the silence of conflict gathering itself, the silence of people who had nothing left to say to each other. This was none of those things. It was simply 2 people sharing the same piece of dark and finding it sufficient. She loved the night sky, he said. He did not say who. He did not have to. What was she like? Fannie asked. She asked it gently, but she asked it directly, because she had found that people who were carrying grief often needed someone to ask the direct question rather than tiptoe around it. Levi was quiet for a moment. The coffee steamed between his hands. Loud, he said, and there was warmth in it that came from somewhere deep. She took up all the space in a room, and she knew it, and she didn't apologize for it. She laughed like it was a physical event. He paused. Sam is like her. That's the part he doesn't know yet, that when he's being the most difficult is when he looks most like her. He'll figure it out, Fannie said, when he's ready for it to be a comfort instead of a wound. Levi looked at her then, really looked, with a kind of attention that she felt in a way that had nothing to do with her education or her professional training. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Say the thing that is actually true without making it hurt more." Fannie considered this. "I suppose I learned it the way one learns most useful things," she said, "from needing it myself and not having it available." He did not ask what she meant. He gave her the same courtesy she gave him, received the answer without weaponizing it, held it carefully. They stood on the porch until the coffee was gone and the wind picked up from the north with a chill that was still possible this late in the spring. And then Fannie said good night and went inside, and she was 3 steps up the staircase before she realized that her heart was beating faster than a cup of coffee and a cold night justified. She told herself it was the altitude. It was not, of course, the altitude. The trouble was that she had not expected him. She had expected a man of business, someone who needed a governess the way he needed a capable ranch hand, practically, functionally, without sentiment. She had expected distance. She had expected the particular kind of detached authority that men of means in 1878 generally operated with, especially toward employed women who were not family. Levi Chandler was not that. He spoke to his ranch hands by name and knew their circumstances. He thanked Gus for a job done well with what appeared to be genuine rather than performative courtesy. He had a complicated relationship with a neighboring rancher named Walt Greer that involved a land dispute that 3 different county officials had failed to resolve, and he dealt with it by riding to Greer's fence line and arguing his position out loud and then riding home again, which struck her as both frustrating and oddly principled. He would not use the legal avenues that his money might have opened to him and simply overwhelm Greer. He wanted it settled correctly. She found this out in pieces. He did not offer information about himself readily, but he did not withhold it when asked, and she asked carefully because she was genuinely interested, and also, she was discovering, because she was a woman who, when genuinely interested in something, could not resist the accumulation of detail. A month into her time at the Rocking Sea, Sam came to find her in the parlor where she was preparing lesson materials for the following week. He stood in the doorway in his characteristic way, weight shifted to one hip, jaw slightly forward, ready to retreat, and said, "Can I ask you something?" "You may ask me something," she said, which was a grammatical correction so habitual she barely noticed she had made it, but Sam had apparently started paying enough attention to language to catch it, because he rolled his eyes and then came further into the room. "Why didn't you leave?" he said. "After I had the gun." Fannie set her pencil down and gave him her full attention, which he seemed to find both welcome and alarming. "Because a gun in the hands of a frightened child is not a reason to leave," she said. "It is a reason to stay." Sam was quiet. He was chewing on something. "I wasn't frightened," he said. "Of course you were," she said gently. "You were frightened of another person walking through that door and then walking back out again. That is a perfectly understandable fear, given your recent experiences." The color that came into Sam's face was not embarrassment exactly. It was the particular flush of a child who has been seen through and has not decided yet how to feel about it. He stood there for another moment and then he said, "The arithmetic, the part about fractions, I don't understand it." "Sit down," Fannie said. "I'll explain it again." He sat down. She explained it again. It took 40 minutes and 3 diagrams and one heated argument about whether it was strictly necessary to know what 3/8 of a herd of 600 cattle amounted to. But at the end of it, Sam understood fractions with the particular thoroughness of a child who had not just learned a concept, but had been persuaded to care about it. And he went to bed that night having asked her whether there were other things like that, mathematical things that connected directly to ranching. Because if there were, he thought he could manage being interested. "There are many such things," she told him. "All right," he said, and went up the stairs. She stood in the parlor and thought about the fact that she had not felt this useful in years. It was at the beginning of June that the secret Levi Chandler was carrying began to show itself at the edges. It started with the man from the land office in Laramie who rode out on a Thursday and spent an hour inside with Levi. And when he left, Levi was standing on the porch with the expression of a man who had received news that confirmed his darkest calculations. He did not tell her what the meeting was about. She did not ask, not then, not immediately. But that evening she heard him in his study, which was a small room off the back of the house that he used for accounts and correspondence, and she heard papers being sorted with the particular violence of a man who is furious and has nowhere to put it. And the next morning she woke to find a telegram on the kitchen table that he had left lying open, not hidden, which she interpreted as either oversight or a form of indirect communication. The telegram was from a lawyer in Cheyenne. It referenced a deed claim. It referenced a man named Roland Pratt. Fannie had not heard the name before, but within 3 days she had heard it from 4 different directions, from Gus, who mentioned Pratt in passing while she helped him with a harness repair, using the name the way people use names that carry weight. From the postmaster's wife in the nearby town of Clearfield, where she rode with Cecily to collect supplies, who mentioned Pratt's name in connection with 3 properties that had changed hands under disputed circumstances. From Danny, who had overheard things from behind doorways with the particular talent of very quiet children, and who told her solemnly that the bad man wants our ranch. And finally from Levi himself on a Sunday evening in the 3rd week of June, when the heat of the Wyoming summer had arrived and they were sitting on the porch again in the dark, and the easy silence they had developed between them had a different quality to it that she recognized as the pressure of something needing to be said. She did not push, she waited. "I have a problem," he said at last. "I know," she said. "Roland Pratt." He looked at her. "How did you—" "I pay attention," she said. "I told Cecily that was one of my useful qualities." Something like a smile moved through his expression. Then it faded back into the weight. "He's a speculator," Levi said. "He bought up land south of here 2 years ago using deed claims that were technically legal if you argued them in the right court, which he had the money to do. He wants the rocking see my land sits between 2 parcels he already owns, and he has been patient about it." "What does patient mean in this context?" she asked. "It means he has been slowly making things difficult," Levi said. "The water rights dispute last year, the cattle that went missing from the south pasture in February. And now," he stopped. "Now he has apparently found a deed claim from before I acquired the property, an old Mexican land grant claim that his lawyer says supersedes my title." Fannie was quiet for a moment. "Is there merit to the claim?" "My lawyer says no, but Pratt's lawyer is better than my lawyer," Levi said. "And the court date is in 8 weeks. What happens if you lose?" He did not answer immediately. And in that pause she understood everything: the flowers on the windowsill, the careful stocking of the house, the children's wildness given room rather than constantly constrained. All of it was the stewardship of a man trying to hold together the only thing that remained of the life he had built. "Then we leave the rocking sea," he said, "and the children lose the last piece of their mother that is still somewhere they can touch." The grief in his voice was so controlled and so enormous that it sat between them like a third presence. "All right," Fannie said. She set her coffee down on the porch rail. "Then we need to look at the documents, all of them, the original deed, the land grant claim, anything you have from the acquisition." Levi looked at her. "You know land law. I know how to read documents carefully," she said, And I know how to find the question that has not been asked yet. My father was a lawyer. He died when I was 15, but I spent every available evening before that in his office reading everything I could reach. She met his eyes. Let me look at it. He brought the papers to the kitchen table that night. She read them all. She read them twice. She made notes in the margins of her own notebook, and she asked him questions that he answered with increasing surprise at their specificity. And by midnight, she had found something that the Cheyenne lawyer had not flagged: a discrepancy in the surveying notes attached to the land grant claim. A boundary description that placed two of the grant's reference points in a location that was inconsistent with the actual geography of the land, as established by the federal survey conducted after Wyoming Territories organization in 1869. If the claim relies on the original boundary description, she said, and the boundary description is internally inconsistent with documented geography, then the claim is invalid. Levi stared at the papers and then at her. How did his lawyer miss that? He did not miss it, she said. He calculated that your lawyer would miss it. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences they had shared. This one had something electric in it, a kind of charged awareness that she felt in her fingertips and along the back of her neck. Fannie, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He seemed to hear himself do it and stop, and she watched the awareness move through his expression, awareness of the hour, of the empty kitchen, of the papers between them and what it meant that they were both here over them. Send those findings to your lawyer in the morning, she said, keeping her voice professional and even, with my notes. He held her gaze for one more moment, then he nodded. Yes, he said, I will. She went upstairs. She stood in her room in the dark for a long time. She had been avoiding something, had been aware of avoiding it with the careful sidestep of a woman who knew exactly where a particular path led, and was not certain she was ready to walk it. The feelings she was developing for Levi Chandler were not simple feelings. They were not the manageable, contained affection of a woman who admired her employer. They were something much more inconvenient, deep and specific, and rooted in the recognition that this man was someone she would have chosen, under any circumstances, in any setting, not because he was handsome, though he was, not because the ranch was beautiful, though it was, but because of the specific quality of his attention and the careful way he held the world he was responsible for, and the fact that he had put wildflowers on her windowsill and had never once mentioned it. She was also aware, with the rigorous honesty that was one of her consistent characteristics, of the forbidden nature of the situation. She was employed in this house. The power differential was real and she took it seriously. She was not a woman who made decisions carelessly, and she would not let herself be carried away by Wyoming skies and strong coffee and a man who had never once made her feel small. She put it away. She was very good at putting things away. Except that things that are put away do not stay there. July arrived with temperatures that baked the grassland copper and drove the cattle to the creek beds, and made the children even more energetic and ungovernable during the hours they were supposed to be indoors for lessons. Fannie adapted. She moved the classroom outside to the shade of the big cottonwood behind the barn, which Danny loved because Rosa could join them, and Sam tolerated because he could at least see the horses, and Cecily accepted because she was becoming, in her careful and private way, genuinely engaged with the natural philosophy texts that Fannie had sourced from the Laramie Lending Library, a circulating collection of books maintained by the Episcopal Church and available to those willing to ride 40 miles for them. The library trip was Levi's idea. He proposed it on a morning in late June as a Saturday excursion, the four of them, plus the ranch wagon, and he framed it in terms of Cecily's education, but Fannie suspected that the excursion itself was the point. She was correct. They left at dawn to make the return trip manageable, and Levi drove the wagon with Fannie beside him on the bench and the children in the bed behind. And they talked for 4 hours each way about things that had nothing to do with the Pratt lawsuit, or the children's lessons, or any of the practical architecture of daily life at the rocking sea. They talked about books, which turned out to be a subject Levi had private depths in. He had read more than she expected, self-taught and voracious in the way of people who come to reading late and make up for lost time with intensity. They talked about the land, which he knew in such specific, loving detail that listening to him describe a particular bend in the river or the behavior of the aspens in autumn felt like listening to someone talk about a person they loved. They talked, briefly and carefully, about what they had left behind before this place. She about Philadelphia and the position before this one that had ended in a way that still sat poorly, and he about Tennessee and the years before Wyoming that he disclosed in general terms that she did not press. When they arrived in Laramie, she saw him among people he knew, the banker who greeted him by name, the hardware merchant who called him Levi, the women at the church library who asked after the children with genuine warmth. He was known here. He was regarded well. She watched people's faces when they looked at him, and she read them the way she read all faces, looking for the hidden motive, the calculation beneath the warmth, and she found none. He was simply respected. On the return trip, the children fell asleep in the wagon bed, and the sun went down ahead of them in colors she still could not believe were real, and she was holding 3 books in her lap, and Levi was driving in that relaxed, competent way he had on horseback and in everything physical, and he said without preamble, "The lawyer wrote back." She had been waiting for this. What did he say? That the surveying discrepancy was enough to challenge the claim. That he had filed for a hearing in front of a different judge. He was quiet for a moment. He said it was the best news he had received on this case and that whoever had found it had saved my ranch. Fannie kept her eyes on the sunset. "Good," she said. "That's all good. It's a good outcome," she said. "I am glad for it." Fannie. He said her name again, and again it had that quality of something that had broken through a barrier he'd erected. She looked at him. The evening light was doing particular things to the angle of his face, to the warm color of his skin and the dark of his hair, and she was aware of herself being aware of him in a way that was becoming very difficult to govern. "I do not know how to thank you," he said. "I have been trying to find the right way to say it for 2 weeks. "You do not need to thank me," she said. "The children needed the outcome as much as you did. I was working in my own interest." Was that all it was? The directness of the question caught her off balance. She was not often off balance, and she was not sure she liked the feeling, except that in this particular instance it was accompanied by something that felt disturbingly like exhilaration. "No," she said, "that was not all it was." The wagon moved through the darkening grassland, and neither of them said anything more, and Cecily stirred in the wagon bed and asked how much longer, and the moment passed, as moments do, into something that would be returned to rather than resolved. The Pratt lawsuit hearing was in August. Levi rode to Cheyenne for it and was gone for 5 days, and those 5 days had a particular quality at the rocking sea that she did not examine too closely. The children behaved remarkably well, which she chose to interpret as a sign of their growth rather than any specific awareness of her distraction. She taught the lessons and managed the household and helped Gus with a fence repair in the north pasture because 2 extra sets of hands were needed, and she rode. She was learning to ride because Cecily had taken it upon herself to teach her, with the fierce dedication of a child who has found something she can offer that cannot be found elsewhere. She was not graceful on horseback yet. She was earnest, and she did not fall off, which Cecily told her was the main thing. On the 5th evening Levi rode in after dark, and she heard his horse in the yard from her room and came downstairs to find him at the kitchen table still in his coat, dusty from the road, with a look on his face that she could not immediately read. "Tell me," she said. "We won," he said. She sat down across from him. The claim was dismissed. Entirely. The judge found the surveying discrepancy determinative. Pratt's lawyer tried to reframe it, but he stopped. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. "The rocking sea is ours. No one can touch it. I am very glad," she said, quietly, fully, with all the sincerity she possessed. He looked up at her. and everything that had been accumulating between them for 3 months, all the evenings on the porch and the Saturday in Laramie and the midnight at the kitchen table and the moment on the wagon with the sunset behind them, everything was in the way he looked at her, and she felt it in the center of her chest like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "Are you happy here?" She had expected something else. The question disarmed her entirely. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he stopped, started again. "I mean that you came out here because you needed somewhere that required your full attention, and I understand that. I'm not going to pretend that you haven't, that this hasn't been." He was struggling with it in a way that she found, against all her better judgment, endearing. "I need to know if this is a place you could stay," he said. "Not because of the children, although God knows they need you. Not because I want to hold you here if you want to go somewhere else, but because," he met her eyes, "because I need to know if what I am feeling is a trap I am setting for myself or something real." The word he had used, trap, landed in the room with unexpected weight. She understood it completely. She had been asking herself the same thing. "What are you feeling?" she asked. It was the most direct question she had ever asked him, and she asked it because she was done with careful sidesteps and because the alternative was to walk away from something she was not willing to walk away from. "I think you know," he said. "I would like you to say it." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp on the table made gold of everything, and outside the Wyoming night waited with all its enormous patience. "I am in love with you," Levi Chandler said. "I have been for some time, and I am aware that this complicates everything about our arrangement, and I am aware that it may not be something you—" "Levi," she said. He stopped. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been for some time, and I am equally aware of all the complications." The silence that followed was not like any other silence. It was the silence of something enormous settling into its proper place, the way mountains must have sounded when the land was still learning what it was going to be. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His hand was warm and calloused, and she turned hers over to hold it, and the feeling of it was so straightforward and so right that she did not understand why she had spent 3 months being careful about it. "We are going to have to think very carefully about this," she said. "About the children, about what is appropriate." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to throw appropriateness out the window." "Good," she said, "because I am not going to." He smiled then, a real smile, full and warm, the kind she had seen only in glimpses before this, and it transformed him the same way Cecily's genuine laugh had transformed her. She thought she might be in trouble. "Are you staying?" he asked. "I am not going anywhere," she said. They told the children 2 weeks later, in the way of people who take the responsibilities of such conversations seriously. They sat the 3 of them down after dinner, and Levi explained, in terms that were honest without being more than the children could hold, that his feelings for Fannie had grown beyond those of an employer, and that he hoped, if the children were willing to accept it, that things might change between them. The response was not uniform. Danny said, "Can Rosa still sleep in the barn?" And when told that yes, this would not affect Rosa's sleeping arrangements, pronounced himself satisfied. Cecily said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Are you going to try to be our mother?" Fannie met her eyes. "No," she said. "You have a mother." "I would not try to replace her, and I would not want to, but I could perhaps be something additional if you were willing to let me." Cecily considered this with the gravity she brought to all serious questions. Then she nodded once slowly, in the manner of someone who had made a decision they intended to honor. Sam said, "If she stays, does she stay as the governess or as something else?" "That is a very good question," Levi said. "I would stay as something else," Fannie said. "If that is what you all wanted." Sam looked at his father, then at Fannie. He had his mother's quality. Levi had said he took up a room and knew it. She could see it now. He had the confidence of a child who has been loved by someone enormous and has carried that love like a physical fact even through grief. "All right," he said, which from Sam, she had learned, was the equivalent of a formal declaration. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. They were real life, which is harder and better than a fairy tale, and contains within it things that no story fully captures: the small daily weight of 3 children's grief and growth, the ongoing challenge of a ranch that demanded everything and gave back what it chose. The moment in October when a bad storm trapped them inside for 3 days, and the children tested every limit Fannie had established, and she held the limits, and then held the children when the fear underneath the testing broke through. The November morning, when Sam fell from his horse in the pasture and Levi got there first, and held his son's face between his hands with such raw terror that Fannie understood again the depth of what a man risks when he loves. Sam was fine, bruised and humiliated and furious, but Fine and Fannie made him sit still while she checked him over, which he submitted to with only minimal complaint, which she took as a significant measure of their progress. Levi proposed on a Sunday in November. He did it on the porch in the cold, with stars so thick above them that the Milky Way was a river of light, and he did it without ceremony or elaborate speech. Simply turned to her and took both her hands and said that he wanted her to be his wife, if she wanted that too, and that he had put himself through a reasonable period of deliberation before arriving at the conviction that this was the right question to ask. "How long is your reasonable period of deliberation?" she asked. "About 4 months," he said. "That is not an unreasonable period," she said. "My answer is yes." He kissed her then for the first time, and it was a cold November night and the wind had an edge to it, and she was wearing her gray wool coat, but she was warm straight through in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature, and she thought that this specific moment, this man and this sky and this vast improbable country that she had not expected to love, was going to be with her for the rest of her life. They married in February of 1879 in the parlor of the Rocking Sea, conducted by the circuit pastor who came through Clearfield on his quarterly round. It was a small ceremony. Gus and the other ranch hands, the Clearfield postmaster and his wife who had become something approaching friends, and the 3 children, who were not uniformly dignified about it. Danny wore his best shirt and brought Rosa to the door of the parlor as a guest, which the pastor accepted with the equanimity of a man who had married people in improbable circumstances before. Cecily stood straight and held her small bouquet of dried winter flowers with the careful attention she brought to things she cared about deeply. Sam, who had been designated to stand beside his father, wore an expression of concentrated composure that cracked into grinning when Levi fumbled the ring, and Fannie had to catch his hand to keep it from hitting the floor. She became Mrs. Levi Chandler on a cold February afternoon with snow on the Laramie Range, and a fire going in the parlor, and 3 children watching her make a promise she had every intention of keeping. Spring came back to the Rocking Sea with the willingness of a country that does not do anything halfway. The grassland went green in stages from the creek beds outward, and the horses kicked up their heels in the pastures, and Danny's coyote Rosa, now fully grown and deeply affectionate and far too domesticated to survive as a wild animal, lay in the warm afternoon sun on the porch, and allowed herself to be groomed by anyone who presented themselves with sufficient patience. Cecily had her 13th birthday in March, and Levi gave her the bay mare she had been riding since January, made it official, her own horse, her responsibility. Cecily received this with a quiet joy that was more moving than any loud celebration. She named the mare Arroyo, which was Spanish for the small seasonal stream she had been standing beside when Fannie had first heard her talk about wanting to breed horses, and Fannie understood that the name was also a kind of acknowledgement between them that she received with equal quiet. Sam discovered, through a combination of his improved arithmetic and an article in the Laramie newspaper that Fannie sourced for him specifically, that the cattle markets in the eastern cities were shifting in ways that would affect what Wyoming ranchers could get for their beef, and he brought this information to his father with the urgent energy of a boy who has for the first time felt the satisfaction of knowing something important and being the one to tell it. Levi listened seriously and took him to the Clearfield General Store to look at the latest commodity reports, which were pinned on the board near the counter, and Sam stood there reading them with the focused expression of someone building towards something. Danny at 7 was still gentle and dreaming, and full of a natural philosophy that Fannie nourished with every resource she could bring to bear: specimens, observations, the library books she continued to source with determination. He had a quality that she thought, privately, might eventually become either a great scientific mind or a poet. She was not going to try to determine which in advance. Roland Pratt did not disappear quietly. He made 2 more attempts at the rocking sea's southern boundary through the spring of 1879, both legal and both dismissed by courts that had seen his particular approach before. Levi handled them with a patience that Fannie admired, and with the ongoing assistance of her careful reading of every document the other side produced. They had developed a working partnership on these legal matters that was one of the most satisfying aspects of their life together. She brought the precision and the precedent and the untiring analysis. He brought the knowledge of the land and the relationships and the honest authority of a man whose word was known to mean something in the territory. By July, Pratt had moved his attentions to a different property in a different county, and the southern boundary of the rocking sea was theirs without contest. The summer of 1879 was the summer Fannie learned to ride. Really ride, not the cautious, correct, supervised riding of her lessons with Cecily, but the thing itself, the opening up of it, the moment when the body stops managing the horse and starts moving with it. Cecily was a rigorous teacher and unsparing in her critique, but she was also generous with encouragement in the way of those who love a thing and want others to love it too. Fannie came off the horse twice during the process of learning, both times at canter, and she got back on both times without drama, which earned her Cecily's respect in a way that no amount of patient lesson teaching or floor-sitting over dime novels had quite managed. The first time she and Levi rode out together, just the 2 of them, across the south pasture and up along the creek to the high ground where you could see the mountains, she understood what he had been telling her for a year when he talked about the land. The distance became something she could move through rather than something that overwhelmed her. The sky was still enormous, but she was enormous inside it now too, or at least large enough to be in it properly. She pulled up on the ridge and looked west at the mountains with the August light on them, and she felt something resolve in her that had been unsettled since before she had ever boarded the Philadelphia train. "What are you thinking?" Levi asked, pulling his horse alongside hers. "That I was very right to come here," she said, "even though I had no idea what I was coming to." "What did you think you were coming to?" "Well-bred children in an orderly household," she said. He laughed. It was such a rare and complete thing when he laughed. It changed the whole topography of his face, and she still caught her breath at it a little, which she decided she did not need to tell him. "And instead you got Sam and a Colt revolver," he said. "And instead I got everything," she said. He reached across from his horse to hers and caught her hand and held it for a moment in the August warmth. And the mountains were blue and white and permanent to the west. And it was one of those moments that a person knows, in the living of it, is going to matter for a long time. By autumn, Fannie was carrying their first child, a fact she discovered in October and confirmed with the doctor who came through Clearfield on his monthly circuit. She told Levi on the porch in the evening, keeping the tradition of the porch and the dark and the stars, and she watched his face move through surprise and into a joy so full and so careful at the same time that it undid her. "Are you well?" he asked immediately. "Perfectly well," she said. "The doctor says everything is entirely as it should be." He pulled her against him and held her with the particular care of a man who has lost and learned from it, and she rested her head against his shoulder and felt the solid fact of him, and thought about how far she was from the woman who had boarded the train in Philadelphia with a trunk full of McGuffey readers and no idea what waited at the other end of the rails. The children's reactions were again not uniform. Danny, who was 7, said, Will it be a boy? I would like a brother, with such directness that Levi told him there was no way to know in advance, and Danny accepted this with philosophical equanimity. Cecily asked careful questions about Fanny's health and then offered seriously to take on additional household responsibilities, which Fanny thanked her for and accepted to a measured degree. Sam said nothing for 2 days and then found Fanny in the parlor and sat down without preamble and said, "I'm glad you're staying." "I am not going anywhere," she told him. She had told him this before. She said it again because she understood that some things needed to be said more than once, that the saying of them was part of what made them real. He nodded, looked at the floor, then looked up. "I'm glad you found that surveying thing," he said, "in the deed documents. You knew about that." "I heard you and Papa talking," he said. He almost looked embarrassed. "I'm learning to pay attention. You said it was useful." She had said that. She had not realized he was listening. She looked at this 9-year-old boy who had held his dead mother's revolver at the very first woman to cross his threshold since she had gone, and she thought that he was going to be very all right. He was going to be more than all right. "It is extremely useful," she said. "We will add careful document reading to your curriculum." He did not groan. He said, "All right," and she thought that might have been the best morning she had had since she arrived. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was a hard one in Wyoming. The cold came early, and the snow was deep, and the cattle had to be worked harder to keep them from drifting in the blizzards that came in from the north, with a regularity that made February feel longer than any calendar could account for. Levi was outside in it daily, and Fanny worried about him with the focused practicality she brought to all worry, making sure he came in before dark and ate enough, and did not turn a single hard day into an excuse to push himself past sensible limits. He allowed this with a grace that told her he was not unaware of the attention, that he received it as the care it was, and did not mistake it for management. The house was warm. She saw to that. The stove fed and the wood stacked, and the pantry supplied with sufficient foresight to get through storms that came without much warning. Cecily was her effective partner in this, now 14 and capable of taking on real responsibility with real competence. Sam helped Levi with the cattle work when the weather allowed, coming in at dark with the proud exhaustion of a boy learning to be equal to hard things. Danny read and thought and talked to Rosa and helped Fanny in the kitchen with an enthusiasm that was not skilled but was genuine and constant. It was in those long winter evenings that she understood fully what the house had become. It had been a house in grief when she arrived, still solid, still cared for, but missing its animating principle. Now it was full, not in a loud way, not in the way of a house without trouble or complexity, because they had those things and always would, but full in the way of a house where people chose to be present with each other, where the table was a place for real conversation, and the fire in the evenings was a gathering rather than an absence. She had not known she was looking for this. She had told Levi months ago that she had needed somewhere that required her full attention. What she had not told him, what she had not fully known herself, was that she had been looking for a place that deserved her full attention, that there was a difference. Full attention given to an empty thing is still loneliness. Full attention given to something real is life. The rocking sea was real. These children were real. This man was real. She recognized in the quiet middle of a February night with snow against the windows, and Levi sleeping beside her, with the total unconscious trust of an exhausted man who feels safe enough to rest completely, the happiest she had ever been. Their son was born in June of 1880, with the summer sunlight coming in the east window and the sound of the ranch going on about its business below. And Cecily held Fanny's hand through the long, hard hours of it, and the doctor from Clearfield earned his fee. And when the child arrived, it was with the kind of announcement that suggests a person who intends to be heard. He was healthy and loud and dark-haired like his father, and Levi held him with the particular tenderness of a man who knows the weight of what he's holding and is not going to pretend otherwise. "What do you want to name him?" Fannie asked. Levi had been thinking about this for months. She knew because he'd been conducting the deliberation the way he conducted all serious deliberations quietly, over a long period, with occasional oblique references that she had learned to track. James, he said. James Arthur Chandler, he met her eyes, after my father. She had not known his father's name until now. He had given it to her in the giving of it to the child, which was the way Levi Chandler gave things indirectly, incorporated into something larger. "Hello, James," she said. Danny was the first of the other children through the door, and he looked at his new brother with the round-cheeked solemnity of an 8-year-old confronting a significant new fact of the world. "He's very small," he said. "He will not stay small," Fannie said. "Rosa was small when she came," Danny said. "Now she's large." He appeared satisfied by this comparison. Sam stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, looking at the baby with the same expression he had used for all new situations, assessing, careful, not committing until he understood what he was dealing with. Then he came fully into the room and looked at his father. "He has your eyebrows," Sam said. "God help him," Levi said. Sam grinned, and in it was everything, the grief and the growth and the stubborn, surviving love of a boy who had been protecting himself for 2 years, and was only now beginning to trust that the things he loved were not automatically going to disappear. Cecily said nothing for a long moment. She looked at the baby, and then at Fannie, and her pale green eyes had something in them that Fannie recognized as the very precise emotion of a person who feels too much to articulate it and is too proud to cry. "He's beautiful," Cecily said, very quietly. "He is," Fannie agreed. In the year and a half that followed, the rocking sea found its settled rhythm, which was not the same as a simple one. Cecily turned 15 and began the systematic work of building toward her horse-breeding ambitions. Levi, who had seen her conviction and recognized it as the real thing, gave her 2 mares and the use of the south pasture for her beginning herd, a decision that Fannie fully supported, and which Cecily received with the contained intensity of someone who has been given the exact right thing. Sam at 11 was a working partner to his father in a way that had clearly surprised and moved Levi, who had worried. She knew that the years of grief and wildness had bent Sam away from the ranch. They had not. They had bent him deeper into it. He had his mother's will and his father's patience, a combination that made him formidable. Danny remained the gentle constant, the child who moved at a different pace than everything around him, and whose pace, she had come to understand, was not slowness but depth. He was 9 now and reading above his age and producing careful drawings of the plants and animals he observed with a scientific rigor that was genuinely impressive. She wrote a letter to the Laramie School Board on his behalf, outlining his abilities and requesting information about scholarship possibilities for a child of his gifts. She did not know yet what would come of it, but she sent the letter and kept a copy. James at 14 months was walking and determined and possessed of the particular personality that expresses itself most clearly in the refusal to stay where one has been put. He had Levi's eyes and Fannie's tenacity, and the Chandler wildness that she had stopped trying to govern in any fundamental way, having come to understand that it was not a defect to be corrected, but a quality to be directed. She realized on a morning in October of 1881, completely stopped thinking of herself as a governess. She was not a governess. She was a wife and a mother and a woman who read cattle contract documents for accuracy, and rode across the south pasture in the morning light, and knew every fence post of 40 square miles of Wyoming territory. She was a woman who had a coyote in her yard, and 3 horses she had learned to name, and a 4th on the way from Cecily's carefully managed breeding program. She was a woman who sat with her husband on the porch in the evenings and shared the silence that had become the most intimate vocabulary she had ever learned. She had been something else once. She had been a woman in a gray wool dress on a westbound train with a trunk full of expectations, traveling toward a place she imagined she understood. She had understood nothing, and she was grateful for it every day. That October, a letter arrived from the Barton Academy in Philadelphia, from the head mistress, Mrs. Alderton, who had heard through the network of placement correspondence that Fannie Thatcher was now Mrs. Fannie Chandler in Wyoming Territory. The letter was warm and slightly formal, as Mrs. Alderton's communications generally were, and it contained a query, whether Fannie might be willing to correspond about the educational methods she had developed in the frontier context, as several of Mrs. Alderton's graduates now found themselves in similar circumstances and were writing to ask for guidance. Fannie sat at the kitchen table and read the letter twice. James was on the floor beside her building something ambitious out of wooden blocks that Levi had made for him. Rosa's tail was visible through the open back door, wrapped in afternoon sun. She wrote back that evening. She told Mrs. Alderton that she would be glad to correspond, that she had indeed developed methods she could describe, and that the most essential thing she had learned, the thing she would tell any woman going to a frontier household, was to abandon her expectations at the door. Not because the frontier had nothing to offer, but because it had far more to offer than a woman carrying the wrong expectations could receive. "The children I came to teach," she wrote, "were wilder than anything my training had prepared me for, and they were also finer. The country I came to inhabit was larger than I had imagined possible, and it made me larger for living in it. The life I have found here is nothing like what I planned, and it is everything I could have hoped for. Tell your graduates, come with open hands. What is placed in them will exceed whatever they were holding before." She folded the letter and sealed it and set it on the sideboard to go out with the next week's post. Levi came in from the barn in the late afternoon, hat in hand, hair pushed back from his forehead. James immediately abandoned his blocks and made determined progress toward his father across the kitchen floor, and Levi caught him up and held him the way he always did, with that full and careful attention. He looked at Fannie over the top of James's dark head. "What are you smiling about?" he asked. "I was thinking about a letter I just wrote," she said, "about arriving somewhere and finding it completely different from what you expected. And that different is not the same as wrong," she said, "and that the things you were not expecting are sometimes the most important things." He looked at her with that particular look, the one she had first seen in the kitchen on the day she arrived, when the saddle had hit the floor and he had not yet known what to make of her. It was different now, that look. It had 3 years of knowing in it, 3 years of evenings on the porch and midnight at the kitchen table and February blizzards and June birthdays and the full accumulated weight of a life shared without reservation. "I was not expecting you," he said, "not anything like you. I was not expecting any of this," she said. "The ranch, the children, the sky." She paused. "You." James wriggled and was set down to return to his blocks, and Levi crossed the kitchen and kissed her the way he had been kissing her for almost 2 years, with the fullness of a man who does not take the fact of this for granted, who has learned what its absence feels like, and does not require reminding to be grateful for its presence. Outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming October was doing extraordinary things to the light. The grass had gone amber, and the cottonwoods along the creek were solid gold, and the mountains to the west had their first snow on the peaks, bright and clean against the deep blue of the afternoon sky. Danny's voice came from the yard, calling Rosa with the particular tone he used when he had found something interesting and needed a companion to observe it with. Cecily's voice answered from the direction of the pasture, brisk and brief, and fond in the way she had learned to be fond once she understood it was safe. Sam's voice carried from somewhere near the barn. He was talking to one of the ranch hands about something, his voice already carrying the beginning of a man's authority, still with a boy's edge to it. Fannie listened to all of them and felt the house around her and her husband's hands at her waist, and the small determined sounds of her son behind her rearranging his wooden world. And she thought about the woman she had been on the platform of the Philadelphia station with her careful trunk and her catalog of expectations, and she felt toward that woman an immense and loving compassion. She had not known. She had not known that the thing she needed was waiting for her at the end of a 40-mile road across open Wyoming grassland, in a house that was a little wrecked, with children who were a great deal wild, and a man who would put wildflowers on her windowsill and never once mention it. She had not known that the best life she could imagine was a life she had not been able to imagine. There was one more letter that winter, this one from Danny's teacher at the Clearfield subscription school, who had been receiving Danny for weekly lessons for the past year, and who wrote to Fannie and Levi with the particular formality of someone relaying significant news. The territorial school superintendent in Laramie had established a scholarship program for gifted pupils, funded by the Union Pacific Railroad's Education Endowment. Danny's teacher was nominating him. Scholarship would fund attendance at the Laramie Preparatory School, which had opened the previous year, with room and board provided. Levi and Fannie sat together with this letter for a long time. The concern was real. Danny was 9 years old and Laramie was 40 miles away, and neither of them was inclined toward casual separation from their children. But the other fact was equally real. Danny's mind was the kind of mind that needed more than a subscription school could provide, and they both knew it. They talked to Danny, which Fannie insisted upon. Not talk to him in the manner of adults who have already decided and are informing rather than consulting. Really talk to him, laid out the situation, asked him what he wanted. Danny said, "Would Rosa be all right without me?" "Rosa would miss you," Fannie said, "but she would be all right." Danny thought about this for an extended period that covered most of a Sunday afternoon. Then he said, "I would go for the school, but I would want to come back for summers and for holidays." "Of course," Levi said, "and Rosa could stay on the porch." "She is welcome on the porch," Fannie said, as Rosa had always been welcome on the porch. As everyone who lived at the rocking sea was welcome where they were, Danny nodded, satisfied. "All right," he said. "I will go." He went in the spring of 1882, at 10 years old, on a clear April morning with his school books in a bag and Rosa standing at the end of the drive watching the wagon until it was out of sight. He came back at the end of June, brown from the sun and full of things he'd learned, and talking faster than anyone could easily follow, and Rosa met him at the gate with the delight of a creature for whom patience is simply what love looks like when the beloved is absent. Sam watched his brother come home and looked at Fannie and said, "He's going to be a scientist." "Probably," she agreed. "Good," Sam said. "We need somebody to be a scientist." He said it with the absolute ease of a boy who knows his own shape in the world and is not worried about it. He knew his shape. He was going to ranch. He was going to learn the cattle markets and the land and the law that governed both, and he was going to be formidable about it, and the rocking sea was going to be his anchor for the rest of his life. Fannie could see all of this in him as clearly as she could see the mountains from the porch on a clear day. In August of 1882, she discovered she was expecting again. She told Levi in the way she told him important things, directly, without ceremony, on the porch in the evening with the stars above them. He held her close and said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said. "Again." "Good," he said, into her hair. "Good." Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1883 with less drama than her brother had brought, and with her eyes already open, looking at the light with an expression that suggested this was interesting, and she intended to pay close attention. They named her Clara, and she was from the beginning a different creature from her brother, quieter in her observations, more precise in her conclusions, with Fannie's dark eyes and Levi's particular quality of waiting until she was certain before she spoke. Cecily held her and looked at her with the complete love of a 15-year-old who has only just discovered she has the capacity for this specific tenderness. Sam held her with the cautious arms of a 13-year-old who is not entirely sure of his own grip and is taking no chances. James, at nearly 3, held her with the imperfect enthusiasm of a small person who is not yet entirely clear on the concept of fragile, and Levi's hands hovered nearby in permanent readiness. Danny, home for the summer, held her last, with the careful exactitude of a boy who handled specimens with respect and applied the same principle to people. The rocking sea in the summer of 1883 was, if you had the ability to stand at a sufficient distance and see it whole, a particular kind of picture, not a simple one, not a perfect one, but a true one. The land went on in every direction, amber and green and enormous. The horses moved in the south pasture where Cecily's program was producing something genuinely impressive. The cattle were fat and the fences were solid and the books balanced, largely because Sam had started checking them himself at 12 and had found errors that the hired accountant had missed, a discovery that had given him the expression of a man who has confirmed a suspicion he has been nursing for some time. On the porch in the evenings, Fannie and Levi watched the light go down over the mountains and the dark come in from the east the way the dark always came in, enormous and full of stars, and utterly without malice, simply the plain fact of night in a country that had not learned to hide itself. She thought sometimes about the first evening, the porch, the coffee, the silence she had not expected to be comfortable, and then was. How much had been in that evening that she had not been able to see yet? How much of what they were to each other had been already present, already moving beneath the surface of every careful exchange? She had come to find out if wildness could be governed. What she had found was that she did not want to govern it, that the wildness was the point, was the thing that made all of it worth the distance she had traveled to find it. The wildness of the children and the land and the sky and eventually of her own heart, which had been careful for a very long time and had finally stopped being careful and was the better for it. She had expected well-bred children in an orderly household, and she had found 3 wild, brilliant, grieving, wonderful children in a house that needed her. She had found a man who put flowers on windowsills and said her name like it was a door he was deciding to walk through. She had found a country that was too big for her expectations and exactly the right size for the life she actually wanted. She had found, and this was the thing she had not known she was looking for, had not known to look for, had arrived at the far end of a long westbound journey to discover herself. Not the governess in the gray wool dress with the McGuffey readers and the careful professional manner, but the woman underneath all of that, who was fiercer and more patient and more capable of love than any curriculum had told her she was allowed to be. The stars came out in their thousands over Wyoming, and Rosa made her small domestic sound on the porch, and from inside the house came the warm sounds of children and the particular settled quiet of a home that knows what it is. Levi's hand found hers on the porch rail, warm and certain, and she held it. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had known, she thought. From the moment she had faced Sam and the gun and had not flinched, from the moment she had set her bag down and straightened her spine and met those wild green eyes and said, "Put that down," from that very moment, she had known that this was not a place she was going to leave. She had not known why. She had not known what was waiting for her in this house and this country and this life. But she had known, with the unargued certainty of a woman who has learned to trust her own instincts, that she was home. She did not say this out loud. She did not need to. Levi Chandler was a man who paid attention, and he had been paying attention to her for 4 years, and the warmth in the way he held her hand in the Wyoming dark told her that he already knew. The creek ran and the wind came soft and warm from the south, and the mountains stood against the sky the way they had stood for 10,000 years, and would stand for 10,000 more, patient and permanent, and entirely indifferent to the small, beautiful human dramas playing out in their shadow. And Fannie Chandler sat on her porch and held her husband's hand and breathed the enormous air and was, without complication or reservation or anything left unresolved, completely and entirely and permanently home.